All right, so welcome everybody to the latest version of the PIER seminar. I'm for those who, I think I know most folks in the room, but for those I don't know, I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research, and you're at the PIER seminar. So today, our speaker is Mahunan Yedamifi, who from the Department of Economics at Dartmouth College, who will be presenting a paper today on activating parents in helping with student learning. And so the session is being recorded, so please keep that in mind as you're asking questions. Ask yourself, would I be happy having this show up on YouTube someplace? Your tolerance for self-embarrassment may be lower than mine. During this seminar, we tend to ask questions what we call econ style, which means if you have a question in the moment, raise your hand, and Mahunan will respond. If it seems like Mahunan is getting slowed down too much, I will intervene and just say, okay, no more questions. Let's let Mahunan make progress. But I feel like that process allows people to raise the questions while you're thinking about it and try to get it resolved rather than try to remember at the end of the seminar about something you were confused about. Okay. If you're viewing this live stream, you can submit questions by email to PIER_fellowship, PIER_fellowship @gse.harvard.edu, and we can try to forward them, raise them in our discussion. Because we've got some people watching online, we're going to have some of these mics. So when you raise your hand, someone hopefully will run to you with a mic so other people can hear it. Okay, so I started to introduce Mahunan, but I just mentioned that Mahunan's from Dartmouth College. He's a provost faculty fellow and assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Dartmouth. He holds a PhD in economics from University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. His research interests lie in development economics, education, and labor, and his research focuses on the role of parents in managing student learning, as well as the design of low-cost interventions that strengthen parental engagement in low-resource settings. So, without further ado, welcome to Mahunan.
Thank you, Tom, for that great introduction. And thank you to Rachel and the whole CPIER team for giving me this, wonderful opportunity. I say it's wonderful because, I started since this morning, and I could, I engage with, brilliant students, talk to some faculty. So, I mean it when I say it's a wonderful opportunity, to come and present my work, to also, receive feedbacks and so on. So before we dive into, the slides, I would like to kind of give a high-level overview of kind of the genesis of this project and, kind of also tell you what the project is about. So like 20 years ago when I was in middle school, in Ivory Coast, in the neighborhood, we were playing together, like all the kids would get together, play soccer, But there was this interesting pattern where there were a couple of kids whose parents were well educated. And every day when we were playing at a specific time, they would decide to leave. And they would do that even when the parents are not around. They would say, we need to leave, we need to go home and study, And while they're doing that, kids like myself and most other children, like we can play until whatever time we wanted, even when our parents are home, So a few years down the road, by the end of middle school, there was this great divergence where these children whose parents were well-educated completed middle school, and these children whose parents had little to no education, most of them had dropped out. And that got me thinking since that time, where I was like, these friends of mine who would decide to leave, it's not like when they go home, their parents are home with them to help them study or do anything. But the parents just created a structure that can be followed even when these parents are not around. And could that be something that kind of help explain the reason why, children whose parents have little to no education, like some of the reason why these children didn't do well at school? So the core question here is really to try to think about whether like parental managerial, role, is something that we have overlooked in the human capital production process, And when I started thinking about this, like in terms of research, the first person that I will obviously talk to was my father. I went back, talked to my father and some of his friends, and these are people who have no education, to try to understand, like you were doing all this sacrifice to buy the books, pay tuition fee, doing all this financial, investment, which is not even like obvious. Like it was a lot of money that you were spending. But why were you not doing these potential other things that could have maybe make sure that you get a return on your financial investment? And the answer was simple. They had no clue. They literally had no clue. And at this time that, I'm giving this talk right here, there are many parents, I strongly believe, out there who still have no clue because they haven't been through the education production function, like the education system. So the first thing my father told me was, promise me that you will get this project done. Why? Because he strongly believed that this is something that can help other parents not make the mistake that he made that kind of, affected his children's education. And by the way, my father, despite him not like understanding any word of what I'm saying, is currently online watching. So that, hi. So, what I was kind of like trying to, tell in this little story is also documented. There is this large and persistent learning gaps, by income. And when you look at, for instance, in sub-Saharan African countries, and you try to look at, secondary school completion rate, it's low, not only low, but it's also unequal. In a country like Benin, it's around 19%. But when you look at within income groups, you see that it's 4% for the poorest versus 42% for the richest. And these poorest parents tend to be the illiterate one that I'm, talking about, And this low completion rate that we see is also highly correlated with grade repetition, And grade repetition, not only is it correlated with, low school completion, but it's also very costly. Like these countries, there's a CGD report that shows that countries spend hundreds of millions on repeaters. So grade repetition is bad. But at the same time, it's also very common. In the sample of, my study, these are grade 8 students, 59% of them have repeated at least once. And if we focus only on during the academic year during which this study took place, at the end of that academic year, 32% of the students in the control group had to repeat grade 8, So there is a need to understand, how do we improve this, because as economists, we care about, this inequality, if we can put it that way, how do we improve this? So in the literature, there have been many, attempts to try to look at how to improve student outcome on the supply side, the demand side, and so on. In this paper, I will focus on something very specific, parental involvement constraint in low literacy. Because as it is well documented, parents play a big role in the children, future, outcomes. So the literature has kind of laid out two main, hypotheses. The first is that some of the constraints that prevent parental engagement in this low literacy setting is that parents do not really understand the importance of, engaging academically with their children. So there have been interventions that try to nudge parents, sit down and read to your child, do numeracy with your child, and things like that. And the second is that these parents are not, really engaging simply because they have an inaccurate belief about their children's performance. they tend to overestimate how well their children, are doing. And that's the reason why, they don't take any action. And there are a couple of papers that try to look into these things, and the result that come out of this is that this intervention either lead to a null effect or negative effect. Negative effect in the sense that you come and tell this parent that their children are not doing well, 1 year later you come back, the low-performing children drop out from school. And if I try to think from the perspective of my dad, this makes sense. You ask my father to read to me, there's no way he can do that. You tell him that I wasn't doing well at school, there's nothing he can do to change that. So the best thing, the best return on his financial investment is to say, Mauna, I think you've done your fair share, let's go to the farm. Because, the time I spend going to, school, there is other things that I could be doing where my father can get something out of it, So why is it the case that this intervention that works in, places like the US, like in high literacy settings? Why when we take this intervention and we go and implement them in low literacy setting, why are we not finding the, result that we are expecting? So what I argue in this paper is that in this low literacy setting, parents often lack a simple model of how to support learning, given the constraint that they are facing, given their low literacy and so on. How can they support learning, So I reframe, parents' role to, a managerial role. And what this means is basic things such as structuring routines, monitoring, effort, and reducing distraction. So the same thing that I observed back in the day with my friends whose parents were educated. Their parents were not sitting with them and reading anything to them or helping them solve homework. Their parents all just had a structure at home that, these children were following. And this managerial role is also feasible to every parent. Because even my father, despite his low literacy, is a manager. He manages his household. If you think about the household as a unit of production, like quote unquote as a firm. My parents decide who is going to the farm, when, and so they are managers. Just that they're not using that skill that they already have, they're not using that when it comes to their children's education, So that's the kind of the way, I reframe parents' role. So the core question is, can activating this overlooked, role improve student outcome? And that's what we try to answer together. So one question that, someone might have is, how is this different from parental engagement? Because there are tons of work out there, right, on parental engagement and so on. So the way you should think about this is that parental engagement, broadly defined, is this big umbrella. You take 2-3 papers on parental engagement, you will see that they do different things. So within this big umbrella, what I try to do is to impose some structure on a subset of that big umbrella and to isolate, that component and test it and see if that, can change something. And that subset is the managerial role that parent can play, which has nothing to do with sitting down with your child and helping them read. It has nothing to do with, additional, resources like more books or, hiring a private tutor or anything. But just manage the time and effort that the child devotes to education. And let's see if that changes something. So to answer this question, this is what I do. I focus on 8th grade students and their parents in southern Benin. And I designed this treatment that was delivered via phone calls, where we try to achieve these 3 goals. The first is to explain to parents the importance of that role that we are talking about in their child success. And then we provide them with recommendation on how to do that. Because one thing is to tell them that this is important. The other thing is to clearly show them how they can get it done. And the third thing is to follow them during that process. Because it's a new endeavor. And, they need a sounding board when they face some challenges and so on. And then I collected survey data from parents and students and also administrative data to now look at the impact of the intervention on parents, behavior that the intervention tried to target, and also on student, outcome, So these are the preview findings. When it comes to the behavior that the intervention was targeting, first we can see that there's increase in parental involvement, meaning the managerial practices that we encourage parents to take on. Like we can clearly see from parent survey that there is a change there. And we also collected the same data from students so to try to see if maybe parents are, just saying things that will make them look good, right? That's what I try to do sometimes as a parent, And then, we also collect data on time spent on chores to see if now these, students that are part of the study, when we are around exam time, our parents, making sure that they free up some time so that these students can have more time to study. But these two outcomes are self-reported, right? So maybe you don't trust those outcomes. But if indeed parents say that they change these two outcomes as we are able to measure in the survey, then that should reflect on some objective outcome. So the objective outcome I have for the behavioral, that we try to target, the first one is student absenteeism. And we collect data from school on student absenteeism, we see that the intervention reduces student absenteeism. And the second one is parent knowledge about their children's performance, because we never told them about their children's performance. But if indeed they are following the recommendation that we gave them, parents should be more aware about how the children are doing at school. And that's what we find, which is quite beautiful, to see that these parents, despite their low literacy, once they understand their role, they are more aware about how the children, are doing at school, And then once, we see all these changes, in these different behavioral changes, do they translate into improvement in educational outcome? And the first result here is that we find that the grade completion increased by 6% overall. But grade completion can only improve for students who were more likely to repeat grade in the first place. So when we look at that subgroup, we see a 40% increase in terms of grade completion. And when we look at overall GPA, there is a 0.11 standard deviation increase in student GPA. And 1 year after the intervention, we were already gone everything. We went back to collect enrollment data to see dropout. And we can see that dropout significantly decreased for girls and also for students whose parents are illiterate, which kind of show that, at least to me, once parents understand how they can affect their children's education, they are maybe less likely to ask a child to drop out if the child is struggling. They have a certain level of agency, Yes, Tom?
So, Mahanan, are student GPAs based on teacher judgments, or is it strictly based on a score on an end of year test?
Yeah, it's based on tests that they take along the year.
Okay.
So in the first semester they take 2 tests. In the second semester they take also.
So we should view that more as a test-based outcome, where here in the U.S., GPA is some odd mixture of knowledge, but also effort and attendance, and so it's sort of a mishmash of things. But here, this is like saying, tested achievement went up.
Yeah. Students are doing better on those different tests that they take during the academic year. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So what are the contributions that this paper, tries to make? So the first contribution is that, with this work, what I try to do is, there's a literature that clearly documented how important managerial, practices, are for firm productivity. So what I try to show here is to extend that idea beyond firm to, education, and to show that, managerial capital is also important, when we think about, how do we improve student, outcome, And the second contribution that this paper tries to make is that usually when we think about principal-agent model, because the relationship between parents and the children is the principal-agent problem, right? So usually when we think about these problems, it's from, mainly, let's say, 3 angles. Either there is, information asymmetry, or, different incentives, between the principal and the agent and so on. So what I try to do here is to show that role perception, can be a binding constraint on agency. Because here, we didn't change the incentives, but we basically brought the principal to understand that they are the principal and that this is how they can play their role. And, with what is happening, in many countries around the world, sometimes you have situations like this where the principal forget that they're the principal. For instance, in some country, the population forget that they are the one who have the power and, and can make changes happen, So once you get the principal to understand their role, that can lead to, a better outcome. And the third contribution is to the, information friction literature. This literature, has kind of focused on providing parents sometime with information, assuming that, okay, if we provide information to parents, there's a black box through which outcome will improve, And one of the things that this paper does is that we don't even need to be providing parents with that information because they don't have the information, and that's not the reason why they are not engaged. The fact that they don't have the information is a consequence of the fact that they are not engaged. So once parents get engaged, they get the information. And to me, at least, that's one of the most beautiful result in this paper, seeing that these parents themselves go and get that information. And from a policy perspective, this is even more feasible from an implementation perspective versus an intervention where you have to regularly keep parents informed. Once they understand their role, they will go and get the information. So this is a little bit the outline. I will briefly, present the context, then research design, data and treatment details, and then get to the result, and then show some cost-benefit analysis later. Yes, Eric. Mike, yeah.
One of the ways that you were framing this experiment was through agency theory, and you had the parent as the principal and the student as the agent. But sometimes I think it's fruitful to think of the opposite. In the short run, the student's contribution to the family is important, and the parent is sort of organizing the family. But in the long run, benefits of education will primarily accrue to the student themselves.
Yeah.
And so you can think of the parent as being an agent of the kid. The kid is young. When we're young, we have a hard time sort of valuing the future, so the parent is there to help them. And in that setup, sometimes people are like, well, there's this sort of disconnect between the parent's interest and the kid's interest, but it could very well be, as you're saying here, the parents are a well-motivated agent for the kid, but maybe what they lack is this sort of understanding of the ways that they can be most effective in their role as that sort of agent for their kid's future. So
yeah,
I was surprised when it was I think both versions of the agency problem work, but they sort of are subtly different in the framing.
And which one do you think is more beautiful?
Well, it's your paper. You get to decide. But
so because I agree with you that, when I was trying to think about this through the lenses of principal agent, I was like, it can go both ways, So in the end, it's not clear maybe what's, I don't know if I would say the right way, because both, kind of make sense. But let's say if you were a referee, which one would have, you would have, found more interesting, because that's still open,
I guess the one that helps us understand the problem more sharply. But I'm not.
Okay.
You thought much more.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. So let's go a little bit on the context. So I tried to use AI here to generate a beautiful Benin picture, to kind of also do some advertisement for Benin. Come and do research in Benin. It's going to be low cost, and I already have the infrastructure in place, especially for, PhD students, come and do research there. And you will learn some French along the way. So we have nice beaches, if you like, beach. And if you don't like beach and you like more animals, we also have some of them, So, this project took place, in the Atlantic province. It's the largest province in Benin in terms of number of secondary school. And as I said, I focus on grade 8 students and their parents. And in these schools, students stay in what we call class groups. You can be 40 or 50. And you all stay together for the whole year. You take all your course classes together, same teachers, and so on, And this is very important because that will help us really understand, the GP and the grade completion outcome that we have. And then when it comes to parent-school communication, it's weak. I can say it's even in, there's no parent-school communication, if you can put it that way. Because school communicate with parent full report card, and that's 2 report card per year. Other than that, if your child leave the house and say, I'm going to school, doesn't show up at school, you will never know about it. If your child is struggling and is on right path to fail, to repeat, you will never know about it, unless yourself you try to learn about it, And based on focus group that I conducted, what I noticed is exactly what, my experience from my middle school age kind of, taught me, which was that well-educated parents clearly understood this. They knew that it's not only about the financial role. Like, if I pay the tuition fees, but I don't create a structure at home, my child can fail, While parents with little to no education do not necessarily, understand that. So this is a little bit the research design. I work with 40 public schools in southern Benin, and 20 of them are in what I call PIER control groups. And you will see, why I do this. But the whole show happened in these 20 intervention schools. So within these schools, I assign, students into treatment and controls. And this is how the assignment works. So first, we go to each school and we call 8th grade parents, invited them to the school, And then 2,094 of them showed up and were surveyed. So that's like 55%, So my sample will be made of those parents who attended the meetings. And then within each class, I create parent literacy strata within each class. And then I randomize parents into treatment and control at the individual level within strata in each class. And the reason why I do that is just to have balance across, literacy dimension. Why? Because maybe this managerial practice, like recommendation that I'm giving to parents, can only work if you have a certain level of education. So that's something important to learn about. And then once we do that, the treatment group started receiving the phone call. So as you can see, the treatment and control are in the same classroom, same teachers, same everything, And that's why I had these PIER control groups. Because maybe at the end of the day, if I find something, it could be because something negative is happening to these control students who are sharing the same classroom with the treated. Yes, question?
I'm sure you thought about this. Oh, sorry. No. I'm wondering how we should think about the sort of external validity of this type of intervention when we think about the type of parents who showed up to the meeting. I'm sure you've given thought to this, so I'm curious, how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's a very good question. The first thing is that we can never get all the parents to come to the school. So we'll always have, to some extent, that problem. And the second thing is that, if I wasn't, a grad student when doing this and I was Tom or, Eric and I had, enough funding, I could have gone to these parents who even didn't show up, right? I could have done that. But I didn't have enough funding. So when I try to compare the children, whose parents showed up to the children whose parents didn't show up, that's the best outcome I had. And when I do that, I find that there's no difference in the outcome, both at the baseline and even at the end of the study. So if anything, that's suggestive that it's not like these parents are different per se. But so that's the technical answer. But in the field, what happened is that the first part, so we couldn't get all the parents the same day. You have a fixed number of surveyors. And so you have to call maybe 6 parents today and then tomorrow, same thing. So the first parent, when they go back to the neighborhood, these other parents ask them, are they giving you money, when you go there? And then when the answer is no, more and more parents don't want to come. So if I had many surveyors where I could call all the parents to come the same day or the first 2 days, I could have gotten, all these parents, to be part of the study, So they feel like, these people are calling us just to waste our time and ask us a bunch of questions, So that's a little bit, how I can put it. So external validity, at least in this context, I believe if you implement this, and also even students whose parents didn't show up, you will still find the same, result. So I was saying that the treatment group started receiving the phone calls. So this is a little bit the timeline of the whole thing, at least for the student in the room, like just to say that you can do it. It's one academic year, boom, boom, But, initially the plan wasn't one academic year. It was just one semester. And then I ended up spending one academic year in this field. So you have to be flexible, also. So the school year in Benin starts around September, and end in May. And it's divided into two, like first semester and second semester. And as I was saying, in each semester, they take 2 tests. So what I did is that I waited for the first test, and when they took the first test, I went and collected, my baseline survey. And then we started making the phone calls right before the second test. And this test happened in 6 subjects, 6 different subjects. And then we made the phone calls until the last test. And then after that, I went back and collected the end-line survey data, So what's, question on the timeline?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I just very quickly wanted to ask you, what is the mobile penetration rate here in this context? And should we think about this as being more rural, more urban? I've worked in these settings, and my feeling is that very often the leader of the village, for example, has a phone, and that phone, works for everybody. So maybe this could make the treatment a bit combined with the leadership. So that is what the background of my thinking.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I don't know the exact, number of, mobile phone penetration, but in my sample, like one of them, like in 97% of cases, either the father or the mother has a phone. Not like all of them, but it's basic phone. It's not like they need a smartphone or whatever, So quite high, and this is very rural. The study took place in very rural, places similar to the environment where I grew up, I'm trying to work for my people, I'm just kidding. So, so this is a little bit the data set the data that we collected, baseline and end-line parent survey data, on socio-demographic characteristics and parental involvement and so on. And then at the end line, we also interviewed like students to kind of see if the pattern that we see from parents is also from student perspective, is it the case? And then collected administrative data on test scores, and also administrative data on student absentees, and then enrollment a year after the intervention. So this is a little bit what the sample looked like. So as we can see, this household have on average around 6 members. But key things here is to look at mothers' education and fathers. So as you can see, they are both, they have a lower education level compared to their children, because the children are in grade 8 and this parent. And then I conducted the independent literacy test to the respondent, which most of the case is the father. And you can see that half of them are illiterate, So despite some of them even having some year of education, but they couldn't, read the simple DHS style sentence that I, gave them. And these are households that are quote unquote, at the bottom distribution of, income, we can put it that way, because look at whether this household has a study table where the child can just sit and study, about half of them has a place like that where the child can even do that, Yes, questions? Yeah.
Just a quick clarifying question, going back a slide. So survey respondent is literate. You stratified by literacy. How many different levels did you have? Was it just the 2 levels, literate,
Yeah,
not
2.
literate? Okay,
yeah, literate, not illiterate. Yeah, exactly. So now let's dive into the intervention. Like how was the content, decided? So the content was based on 3 things. My personal experience, and then the psychology literature on parental involvement. How do we, about parent self-efficacy and things like that. And then I also conducted in-depth focus group with parents, both literate and illiterate, teachers, school officials, and so on. And based on that, that's how I designed the content that we will go over now. So in the first phone call, what we did is to explain to parents the role of each stakeholder, because these parents have this idea of, I already did my part, which is to pay the tuition fees and buy all the books that you said you needed. So once I do that, everything else is in the hand of the schools and so on. That's the way they think about it. So what we had to try to do here is to bring parents to understand that this is an environment where teachers teach, to the top performers. So most of the learning need to happen outside the classroom. Once you go home, you need to sit down and go over the material. But once students are outside the classroom, they are under the supervision or control of parents. So if parents are not doing anything and there's a laissez-faire, I like playing soccer, and at some point I even decided whether I should go professional or not. But I think I made the right choice, going academia, continue my education. So if parents are not, trying to put some structure around that, they just want to play, And once we explain that to parents, themselves, they realize that they have been missing in the whole picture, and that they can really, change things by, rearranging the way they organize things within the household. So once we do that, we then provide parents with clear, feasible recommendations that they can follow to not only ensure that children spend more time, but to also put some kind of monitoring on these children so that the children now know that, oh, my father is now, checking on how I'm doing and things like that. So, and then in the subsequent phone calls, we try to, link those recommendations to upcoming tests, if there's any upcoming tests, and also discuss with parents if they are facing any challenges. And they face a lot of challenges in trying to do that. For instance, the father will say, from now on, every day at 7 p.m., the children need to be seated and studying. The father is not home, comes back, they are in the kitchen with their mother, and it becomes an issue between dad and mom and so on. So, so it was quite interesting to see how new dynamic shift, household, dynamic is. I think there's a question. Yeah.
This is so fascinating. Can you go back to the treatment description again? Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out, you call this role activation.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm trying to figure out if, maybe I know that I should be a manager, but I don't believe I can be a manager. And what the calls help me do is to believe that I can be a manager. Another idea is that, so it's not just role activation, it's like increasing my, my belief that I can achieve this role. Another idea is that I can achieve the role, but you've raised my standards on what the role should be. So it's not role activation, maybe it's like raising standards on what I should do when achieving the role. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've distinguished between those three?
That's very interesting. And how would you think about distinguishing between, because if you improve my capability in doing these things, then to some extent, isn't that a role activation?
I guess it's
yeah.
I guess it's a question of what you mean by role activation. Because when I heard you initially describe it, it's like, I didn't know I should be a manager. Now I know I should be a manager. But maybe I know I should be a manager, but I don't believe I can be a manager.
Okay.
And that seems different, right? So
yeah. I see. So
I thought this was being a good manager, but now I realize this is being a good manager.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So
yeah.
that's different than role activation to me.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just semantics.
No, yeah, you're right. You're right. So that's a very good question. So the way you should think about it is that the intervention is doing two things. Because we could have stopped at this and not go here. So it's like first at role activation, if you can put it that way, and then giving them feasible recommendation that improve their capability, if you can put it that way. Their ability to really, play that role. That's the way, we can think about it. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a very good nuance. Yeah. So yeah, in subsequent phone calls, that's what we did. Try to discuss the challenges with them. So again, here I'm using my friend AI. To give me a very nice picture that kind of show what it's about. So here are the recommendations. When it comes to action that they can take at school, we encourage them to visit the school to inquire about their child progress, and to speak with teachers about their child and to make random visits to ensure the attendance. Because as I told you earlier, if your child can leave the house but not go to school, and parents who still wouldn't be informed about it. And then when it comes to so we knew that most of these recommendations, that the things that we asked them to do at school, many of them wouldn't do it. Or even if they do it, it's gonna be maybe once. So at the intensive margin, maybe the much won't happen. Why? Because the schools tend to be far away from this, this household. So what we could really bet on is the, changes in, practices that can happen within the household. So within the household, we encourage them to talk to their child about their education. But very importantly, to set a daily study schedule, which most of these households didn't have. Like, you do whatever you want. You want to study, you study. You don't want to study, you don't study. I never had a study schedule in my life, which is, crazy to think about it, because my 4-year-old child, I already have a schedule for him when he's at home. And then to check in with this child while they are studying. And that's exactly what this mother is doing here. She's cooking while also she has an eye on, he's just seated. Whether he's learning or not learning, that's not what I'm trying to talk about here. But just increasing the time, that the contact that the child has with education, And then to ask about test score and upcoming test date, so that you know how the child is progressing. And when you know the test date, you can balance household chores, especially during exam period. And this was also something conflicting, where these parents, as I said, they are managers. This, you have to do this chore, you have to do that chore, and that's it. But sometimes there is an exam around the corner, where maybe the child, needs more time to study and so on. Yeah.
I have two questions. I love how you frame about the parents should be activated as managers, but I was just wondering, for the list of recommendation you give, it seems like you're just increasing parents. You are also increasing parents' effort. So I was just wondering, how do you differentiate activating the role of manager versus just asking the parents to increase the effort versus how to increase the effort?
The parents' own effort, you mean?
Yeah, the parents' effort in monitoring the children.
Yeah, like if you were not a manager and now you start doing it, it will require some work. Maybe I didn't really understand the question.
I guess the framing will be a bit different. We could increase the parents' effort without telling them they are managers.
Yeah, you could have asked parents to start attending parent-teacher meetings. That's also effort. But is that affecting the time that students spend with the material or the effort that students put in work? That's the way, I view. There are thousands of ways where you can make parents work, and that might not necessarily end up with, clearly bringing parents to understand that compared to what you used to do, now is your child spending more time. Now does your child feel like, oh, my dad comes to the school and kind of, no. Now my father asked me how my test score, things like that, yeah. And the beautiful things with this, is that parents don't even need to be home to be doing this. Anyone who is at home around that time could be doing that. And not only that, you could set the pattern there and, give this clear instruction to your child and be like, at 7 p.m., I want to see you sit and study. If I come home and I don't see you seated down and reviewing your school material, I wouldn't be happy. And that's another, part of this whole thing that I'm not touching on, which is how did parents implement this in terms of parenting? Gentle parenting, try to be friends with your kids and get them to understand this and do it, or, so that's something that I can't speak, to. This project is not trying to, answer that question, which is when you give them these managerial, recommendations, how do they get them implemented? Is it the case that children are now in trouble, or is it the case that parents do this in a gentle way and so on, Yeah.
Sorry. I have a question about the at-school recommendations. So to what extent are teachers and school administrators in this setting used to having this kind and level of parental engagement? In the literature on parental engagement in the U.S., for example, the helicopter parent motif, like, teachers and administrators like react to that, and it creates a lot of tension at school too. So I'm curious about how those recommendations were both perceived and whether that has any sort of, I'm not sure if the right word is like spillover effect, but if that changes the way in which teachers and administrators are teaching and managing in those schools.
That's a very good question. So I don't have data on that, but the one thing is that schools were really happy because schools were like, we want parents to come. Like parents like have disappeared. That's the way they put it, But the well-educated parents do go to these schools, like to check, these how their children, are doing and so on. And when I will show the result at the intensive margin, you will see that not much happened here. But at the extensive margin, we do see changes, which is at least they never did it. Now they did maybe at least once, But in terms of doing this more often, we don't see much happening there. Yes.
Yeah, so something that I've been wrestling with is that in the personnel economics literature, there's sort of like this belief that like if managers can't observe effort very easily, that it's very difficult to then like impose new practices because you can't necessarily know whether that will lead to any change in effort. And so when I'm thinking about this project, like the natural thing for me is to think like, what if you gave a control experiment or a second treatment arm where parents were just given the information because this is such a low information setting?
Yeah.
I'm trying to disentangle practices and managerial practices from just pure information of like how well their kid is doing. And
how well the kid is doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are previous work that provided that information. And either it leads to zero effect or negative effect, where a year after they come and collect data and they see that parents ask the low-performing child to drop out when you provide them purely performance information in these low literacy settings. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. So some of the recommendations and also this stuff strikes me like it does overlap with like the broader parental engagement literature. I'm wondering if like your survey, you kind of measured different aspects of both the managerial like tasks versus other like educational involvement tasks, like parents actually sitting down and teaching them the material. And also, do you measure it at like you have some index of general involvement at baseline?
Yeah, so that's how I try to make my paper different from kind of the literature. I don't expect this parent to sit down and do anything with their children, because they can't do it. And that's why when I see, previous work where people work with people like my father and ask them to read to their children, I'm like, there's no way, like this is an artifact. How would my father read to me? He just can't do that. He doesn't have the ability to do that. He's not educated, So here I'm not, I'm not targeting this big umbrella of parental involvement because there is so much into it. What I'm trying to do is that within this big umbrella, let me, put some structure on something specific, that is both feasible to, regardless of, parental literacy, and then let's see if that can change something. Because maybe that won't change anything, So that's a little bit, So I'm not saying here that the effect that I will show you stem from parents being able to sit down or, hire a new tutor, like it's not coming from that, Purely, and as you can see, the list of recommendations, this list will affect two things. Either it will affect the effort the child put in because the child is like, now my father knows. Or it will affect the time. Because if I used to leave the house and I don't go to school, now that I know that my father make random visit, I will be in class. And now set a daily study schedule. Like, it's clear now, I need to spend this time, Whether I'm reading, whether I'm really reading something or not, my father can't control that, can't check that. But I'm seated, So when I started this, I was like, let's see, what we find, at the end of this. And if we find something, it means that there's a lot of learning that can happen by students themselves, that we are not tapping into that, And that's kind of what I'm trying to show here, that there is a lot of learning that's available there. And if you structure time around students, these kids are magical, but you need to put some structure around them, So,
now I want to
Suspend the econ style. Continue, yeah. So this is a little bit the distribution of phone calls. Or on average, like they receive 10 phone calls, and that's like a success rate of 88%, and that's balanced across different subgroups. And this is the usual balancedness table, across many dimensions. And as you can see, it's overall treatment and control are balanced. So to measure the impact here, I measure the intent to treat, because obviously based on some of the questions that you all raised, some parents might not be reachable and things like that. So I regress my outcome on a baseline value of the outcome, and then include my treatment dummy, and then a set of covariate that I select using double post lasso. And then I include strata fixed effect, and also cluster my standard error at the individual level. So let's look at the behavioral outcome. So the first table here, what we have in column 1 is parental involvement at school index. Think of those 3 recommendations that you saw there. So we ask parents, and we measure that at the extensive margin and also at the intensive margin. And as we can see, we see some improvement along that dimension. And then in column 2 and 3, what we do is that I collect data from both parent and also student when it comes to parental involvement at home. And the reason why I didn't do this for parental involvement at school is that while parents are taking this action at school, students may be in class and might not be aware of that. But when it comes to parental involvement at home, those actions that we said parents should be doing, if they are indeed doing that, children should be aware of it. So we collect data from parents and also from students. And as we can see, regardless of the source of the data, we can see that there's improvement happening there. And then the third outcome that I look at here is whether students are doing fewer chores. So the question was this, does it happen that a chore that you usually do, your parents ask you not to do it, but to go and sit down and study, like basic, And as you can see here, both from parents and also from students themselves, you can see here that now the probability that the student are doing fewer chores increase, But if the focal student is doing fewer chores, someone must be doing more. So I asked that question, who is doing more? And we can see that both parents and other siblings also help, in taking on some of these chores. So this is specifically around exam time, that's what we measure. Yeah.
So Mahunan, could you explain the difference between intensive margin and extensive margin?
Okay, so the extensive margin, what we are asking, what this measure is basically, if it's, for instance, visiting the school, does that happen at least once over the period that we are measuring? And the intensive margin is how many times did that happen, So that's basically what we are looking at. And if we had time and I show you the details, you will see that for parental involvement at school, when you look at each of those behavior, like recommendations that I showed you earlier, at the intensive margin, you will see that we have no effect. But at the extensive margin, there's an effect, showing that parents at least engage into those behavior at least once, but didn't, do that, often, which is the opposite for parental involvement at home. And then this outcome that I show you here, you might not believe in them. You'll be like, these are survey data, self-reported, I don't believe in them. But if indeed parents are taking up these actions, we should be able to pick that up in something like, student attendance. And as we can see here, overall, student attendance, the probability of student missing class at least, once decreased by around 7 percentage point. And then the second objective outcome that can also confirm whether parent indeed started taking those actions that the recommendation that we provided them is to look at how knowledgeable parents are about their children's performance. So in the first column here, what I do is that I know the actual GPA, and I ask parents what's the child GPA. And I take the absolute value of that difference, But as you can see, the sample size is very small. Because these parents with little to no education, they don't even know the number. They don't even know, many of them don't know. And they don't even care about it. What do they care about? They care about whether, you have a passing grade or not. That's what they care about. So on both of these dimensions, you can see that there is indeed improvement in parent knowledge about the children's performance. So which means that indeed they are now asking the child how the child is doing and things like that, at least. And then let's look at the educational outcome. So the first here is grade completion. And overall, we can see that grade completion increased by 4 percentage points. So that's a 6% increase compared to the control. And then let's try to look at, different groups based on baseline, performance. Because those at the bottom quartile are those who are more likely to repeat grade. And at the end of the school year, in the control group, 70% of students here repeated, So when we look at that, we can see that here is a 12 percentage point increase in grade completion. That's a 40% increase compared to the control mean. So these parents who have little to no education, they start implementing these things, and even these struggling children are able to do way better. So that shows that there's a lot of learning on the table that we are not looking at. The next heterogeneity that I look at is based on parental literacy. As you can see, on average, these parents have low education. But there is still a margin of literate versus not literate. And this is very interesting. We can't reject equality, which shows that you don't need to be literate or not to be able to, implement this, like this recommendation that we are showing you, like we provided to this parent, And then the last heterogeneity is on, student gender. And as we can see also here, we can't reject equality. So parent didn't, accept the recommendation differently based on whether the focal student was a girl or a boy. And these two together are also, still very informative. And then the next result that I look at is year-end GPA. Because grade completion might not pick up improvement in students who would have passed, completed grade anyway. So let's look at year-end GPA. And when we look at that overall, we can see a 0.11 standard deviation increase in year-end GPA. And when we look at heterogeneity across baseline performance, we can reject equality. And as you can see, it's very noisy. And then same thing for parent literacy, same pattern as before. And also when we look at female by student gender, we can also reject equality, although, it seems that, girls are, there's an increase by 0.2 standard deviation for girls. But we can reject equality, And then I look at different heterogeneity by semester, by different subject and so on, And then I do a set of robustness check, to see if the result that I just showed you, those results are sensitive to different specifications. And then a year after the intervention, I went back and collected data on enrollment. And overall, as you can see, we don't see much. But when we look at across these two heterogeneity dimensions, and by the way, these are the two pre-specified, heterogeneity that I have, we can clearly see that dropout falls by 33% for illiterate parents and by 12% for female students, which is very interesting because this is 1 year after the intervention, And there are some potential concerns. The first is negative spillover. Like you do this, parents get engaged, resources are taken away from the control student who share the same classroom with treated student. The second would be maybe now that parents are doing this, they need to cut down hours that they work, hours work and things like that. So I try to do my best to look at these two potential concerns. So when it comes to the first, that's where I use the 20 PIER control schools. So what I do in the first column here, I compare my treated student from my interventional schools to this PIER control student. And as you can see, the grade completion, which was 4 percentage points, is now 6 percentage points. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing is that I take my control student from my treatment in schools and compare them to the PIER control student. And when I do that, we can see here that, there is nothing there. And the third is that I put the treated student in my treated schools, I put them together with my control student in my treated schools. So basically comparing the intervention schools to the PIER control school. And when we do that, we do find the same impact as when we compare treatment versus control within intervention school. So if anything, this is suggestive that maybe there is some positive maybe spillover, happening somewhere, there. And if anything, at least we see that there's no negative spillover, taking place on control student. Yeah.
So Mahunan, so you looked at spillovers using the students in the PIER control schools.
Yeah.
But what about possible spillovers, either positive or negative, on siblings in the same family? You know, this is related to the effort question from before. So I grew up in a family of 5 kids. I think you told me before you have a big family too.
Yeah.
So if my mom and dad, because we're part of this study, because, you know, they're asking about me, you know, suppose I parents like double the share of time they're spending with me, you know, because of all the attention of being part of the study, that could generate a gain for me, but maybe a loss for my siblings. But if it is this managerial thing, then it could benefit all of my siblings.
Yeah. So I couldn't, you know, collect data on that, because that would mean, you know, finding the schools of all the other siblings and go and collect the data, you know. So I didn't have funding to collect data, you know, on that. But if anything, the recommendation, the way we provided it was not, yes, we contacted the parent based on the focal child, but the recommendation are broader recommendation in terms of how you can support your children, you know, education. So that's the way we view it. So, you know, I assume that maybe, you know, if anything, it will be positive spillover within the household, because we are empowering these parents to understand that they have a say in their children's education. You know. And then for the financial involvement, I collected data on tuition fees from schools to try to see if these parents who are treated are now late on tuition fees and things like that. And as we can see, there is nothing there. So the last thing, you know, given that we are running, you know, a little bit short on time, the last thing that I want to show is the cost-benefit analysis. So with all these interesting results that I've shown you so far, if you believe me, the next question is this something profitable for a government to think of implementing, you know? So let's kind of go over the numbers. So the intervention costs around $9.5 per student. And then let's assume that we provide this intervention to 1,000 students who are the bottom, you know, quartile of, you know, performance, you know. If we do that, we'll be able to, you know, prevent grade repetition for 120 of them based on the 12 percentage point, you know, increase. And as I said, grade repetition is very costly. It costs around $149 to the Benin government. So if we do this math, that's $17,880. But when you repeat grade, there is also private, you know, saving happening when you repeat, we prevent grade repetition. Because if you repeat, your parent need to pay tuition fees. And on top of that, there are many other expenses, but I'll focus only on tuition fees. And that's like $3,600. So if we put these two, you know, averted grade repetition, you know, benefit together, and we compare that to the cost, we can see that, you know, the benefit outweighed, you know, the cost. But obviously this, you know, there are other assumptions, you know, behind, you know, this basic, you know, cost benefit that I showed you, you know. And I have, you know, another cost benefit analysis where basically I try to go deeper with an accounting model where I ask myself, okay, let's assume that they complete middle school and down the road they start working and they pay taxes, you know. And even when you take that route, you know, impose more assumptions, but in the end, you know, the intervention is very highly cost effective. So to conclude, I designed this intervention, you know, information intervention to improve parents, you know, management of their child time and effort, and tested the intervention, you know, by running a field experiment in Benin, and I find improvement in grade completion, student performance, absentees, and parental involvement. And a year after the intervention, dropout falls for girls and students whose parents are illiterate. And this parent managerial role does not crowd out the financial role in their children, at least via tuition fees, you know, that I mentioned. And the intervention is very cost effective. Thank you very much.
So, questions?
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. So in the managerial literature, there is managers often need to use extrinsic incentive to manage or elicit more effort. So I was just wondering, in your setting, do you have any evidence on whether parents use intrinsic incentive or use extrinsic incentive, or they just like set the rules? Because I think it actually really matters on whether you can crowd out students' long-term intrinsic motivation. There has been a recent paper published at Journal of Political Economy that actually find that parents, when parents use extrinsic incentive, it crowd out students' incentive to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't have, data on that. I don't have data on how parents within the household like implemented, the recommendations and so on. But given, the financial level and, the financial status and everything, I'll be surprised if maybe, they were relying mainly on extrinsic, incentives and so on. But I don't have data to really touch on that, And I was saying earlier, that's something very interesting to look at. Like when you provide this recommendation to parents, how does that affect the dynamic within the household? This parenting style to get this recommendation, followed and so on. That would be very interesting to look at. Yeah.
But even without any financial incentive, the parents could just say, oh, if you do this, then you get extra time to play. Versus, oh, if you do this, you will actually learn and grow. Like, I was just wondering, like, in general, how do you think the parents are implementing?
Yeah, like my thought would be that there is no story of you will have extra time to play. They have all the time in the world to play before the intervention. Like they were just playing. Like myself, like we would just play soccer until whatever time, So I think students have overused, like all, so when parents get in, students, I guess, wouldn't really like that parents are now stepping in because you're reducing now. I can do whatever. In the past, I could do whatever I want. Now I can no longer do that. So the way I see it is that, it was a shock for students that my parents would never ask anything, never check anything. One day now, there's a structure. I need to sit down. There are some chores that I used to do. My parents now ask me themselves not to do it and sit down and study. So I feel like students, one day they wake up and they see that, there are some changes here. We move from I don't know, maybe Major League Soccer to Premier League, something like that, Yeah.
Turn off. Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Forgive me if this is outside the scope of your paper, but
Totally fine, yeah.
I'm thinking about these mechanisms again. And when we were having this conversation about the motivations of the intervention, I think you mentioned the potential effects of the intervention on the sort of more academic outcomes as one, the student putting forth more effort in their work, and two, the student simply having more time in front of their work because of the managerial, actions of their parents. But I think I'm thinking about two other kind of potential mechanisms that you might have already thought of. I mean, one being the developmental impact on children of routines. I'm not a developmentalist, but I am, aware that the establishment of routines, particularly among young children, but perhaps in adolescents as well, can be really impactful on students' cognitive skills and students' study habits. So I'm thinking about that as one mechanism. And then another mechanism that it seems like you probably don't have data to confirm or not confirm, but also along the same lines, thinking about the formation of secure attachments between children and their parents, and sort of by telling parents, hey, you can do these managerial actions, you can interact more with your kids, what you're really doing is creating more face time between parents and children that is perhaps creating these more secure attachments, which, again, is positively correlated with, lots of cognitive outcomes for children. And so I'm curious if although the sort of intervention is framed as sort of like activating this managerial capital, which I think is certainly a component of it, I do think there's sort of an alternative explanation, which is perhaps that the managerial activation is second order to the creation of these routines and these secure attachments that we know positively impact student achievement.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a really good one. And as you already said, I don't have data to speak to that, but I think part of that could be happening where, my parents never, quote unquote, never cared, if I can put it that way. But they did care. Just that the way they express that they care about education is to pay your tuition fees, and they think that, they are done. So now that you see that, they are checking on you, how was school? Sit down and study. That can create exactly, what you are saying, And, you all know better than me that one of the thing that will make you successful in a PhD is your managerial capital, about how your project and everything, And I'm already teaching those things to my children who are like kids, and they will grow up with that. So I agree that, the impact can go, beyond the scope of the study and affect long-term outcome and so on, and also affect the relationship that, But I think it would be good to have a study where we look at within the household. Because maybe there could be some household where now children might hate their parents, at least in the short run, And maybe later on be like, all these things that my parents, when I started paying bills the first time in my life, that's when I was like, my parents were right about so many things that I hated them for, So it would be good to really look, within the household and see, how it's happening, especially in this low resource environment. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Mahunan. Great presentation. I have a three-part question. I want to ask one part first, and then I'll ask two more, if that's okay. Sorry about that. One, I came a bit late, so I might have missed this. One question is, do you have age variation in the children in this setting? And if yes, do you know the heterogeneity by age?
By age?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have student age, but I didn't look at the heterogeneity by age.
Okay. Because, sometimes age is correlated with how much you are motivated by what your parents tell you to do. So that's kind of one thing that could be correlated with some of the mechanisms. I think also it seems this question of mechanisms is one that people are interested in, and I'm also interested in. I have a slightly more negative take on a potential negative mechanism, which is that to succeed in some of these school settings, one has to learn to be submissive to authority. And so then in the home, the parent could potentially be creating a space where one is learning to be submissive to an adult kind of enforcer. And so this is another potential mechanism that one might want to think about. The third part is, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, but and so that's kind of a question, I guess, but also a comment. This third one is definitely just a comment. There's a really nice book by a philosopher, Jacques Rancière, called The Ignorant Schoolmaster, about a pedagogy by
What's the title again?
The Ignorant Schoolmaster.
Okay.
So it's a pedagogical approach by which illiterate people teach literacy to others. And I think that could be an interesting kind of way to interact this heterogeneity effect with illiteracy. Although, of course, again, there are many potential mechanisms that would be consistent with that, but I thought I'd throw that.
Thank you very much for this. In the end, I feel like all of these are comments rather than questions, and thank you, very much for the comment. So the average age is around 14 for these students. So like heterogeneity in a continuous way, or you think, but how much variance do I have there? I will look into that. Yeah, I will look into that and see. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Related to a lot of the questions that we've been talking about, I think you have a really interesting story about self-regulation. you introduced in your materials that you actually said, children can't self-regulate. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how that was actually communicated to parents, because I think your findings tell a story that maybe when given the opportunity, they can self-regulate when given structures. Sort of what Elizabeth was saying, self-regulation is a skill that when provided opportunities to grow on, children can develop. So I would just love to hear a little bit more about what was actually communicated about self-regulation to the parents, and then maybe after the fact, if there were any changing beliefs about what parents believed children could or couldn't do for themselves with or without that structure.
I see. So the way we communicated with parents was, just to, bring them to themselves tell us the usual dynamic in the household. And then they would be like, oh, they go to school or she goes to school, come back. If it's a boy, play with friends, and then later on, whatever, and then eat. And then when parents themselves start thinking about that, they clearly see that there is no way in this whole thing where parents ask children to study. And a lot of the time, these children themselves don't even do that. They don't study. So then we brought parents to realize that exactly that's the point. Because if learning happens when students are home and they need to do homework, they need to review the lesson and so on, like basic things, and you don't create this environment, they want to play soccer. And parents themselves say, yeah, he will come back, and then while his sister is home or whatever, but even the sister, when she's home, she will be in the kitchen. And I have another project looking at that, But the boy will not be home, but maybe playing soccer until, whatever time. So we just kind of brought parents to understand that, you need to create a structure where, let's say, at a specific time, they need to be seated and study. And if it's 7 p.m., 8 p.m., whatever, they need to be seated. So it's not like the intervention took total agency away from these children. I don't think the intervention did that, but to some extent, kind of at least reduce a little bit, how much time, how much, freedom these children, had in this environment. That's a little bit what I can say to that. Yeah.
Since I have the microphone, I'm going to be... Hi, Mahunan. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm Sandra, and I'm wrapping up my PhD here. And my own research is on parents' beliefs and practices. But my sample is Parisian parents, so Paris, France, very different context. And 90% of my sample have a master's or a PhD. Very, very different context that I'm working with. But I do look at parental self-efficacy. And so this is partially driven by my own research interests, but also maybe building a little bit on Andrew's earlier question, is that I wonder if you have collected anything at all, because you also mentioned Sandler in your lit review in the beginning. I wondered if you collected any measures on parental self-efficacy before and after, and also if the results of this have been or will be communicated with the parents so that you can actually tell them your actions directly caused this improvement in your child's results. And we have scientific evidence to prove that. And then I wonder if that would also further show some difference in whether you communicate it with some and some not.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I'm not sure we collected parents' self-efficacy both at baseline and endline. Maybe at baseline, maybe at baseline we collected data on that. So, and what was the second part of your question again? Exactly. So, do they know they caused this? Yeah. So this is one of the things that I really love about this project, which was that at the end, during the endline survey, parents came with gifts. Some even came with money. That's how happy they were, And and even until now, some of those parents are still calling the facilitator that were making the calls and be like, this is, my child graduated, my child did this. They were genuinely, happy. And to me, regardless of where this get published, that's big. And that goes back to what the reason why my father asked me to promise him that I would get this done. Because he strongly believed that some parents will realize these basic things that they can do that will help them get a return on their financial investment. So parents saw themselves the effect right away, if I can put it that way. I never went back to tell them the result, but if they brought those gifts and so on, it's because themselves they saw that this is something that is helping them. Yeah, and I'm very happy about that. Yeah.
So I would just add at the end that as a parent of a 20 and a 25-year-old boy, my sense of parental self-efficacy has declined over time. Actually, it's very, very low at the moment. So let's all just thank Mahunan for joining us.